Sunlight through triple-pane polymer doesn't warm the skin. It just makes the dust motes look like falling ash. In a room full of three-eyed scholars cataloging human brutality as if it were a flawed equation, Paige kept her hands flat on the desk. She didn't need a slate. She lived the syllabus. The air inside the lecture hall at the Riverdale Central Academy always smelled faintly of ionized copper and dried chicory. It was a sterile, engineered scent designed to keep the lungs clear and the mind sharp, but to Paige Keller it just smelled like the interior of a medical transport before the morphine ran out. She sat on the back row of the tiered amphitheater. The seats were molded from a dense, cold polymer that never quite adapted to human body heat. To her left and right, 37 students of the high-born lineage sat straight-backed, their long, multi-jointed spines barely touching the support rests. They were young, smooth-skinned, and radiated the quiet, unearned confidence of people whose home planets had never seen a planetary blockade. At the center of the pit stood Professor Arthur. He wasn't human, though his translated name was an accommodation for the small diplomatic contingent that had crawled its way into the Academy's funding budget after the Reconstruction treaties. He was tall, his skin the color of damp limestone, with 4 narrow nostrils that flared rhythmically as he spoke. He didn't use a microphone. His throat clicks were amplified by the acoustic architecture of the room, turning every consonant into a tiny, sharp snap. We begin today with the logistical collapse of the Terran 3rd Infantry at the Iron Ridge Tactical Perimeter, Arthur said. He waved a long, 4-fingered hand, and the holoprojector in the center of the floor hummed to life. A 3-dimensional map materialized in the air, glowing a soft, sickly amber. It showed a jagged mountain range, a narrow valley, and a series of blinking blue dots representing the defending human forces. Opposing them was a massive, solid block of crimson, the mechanized armor units of the old hegemony. The engagement is a textbook study in primate cognitive dissonance, Arthur continued, his voice dropping into the smooth, rhythmic cadence of a man who had delivered the same lecture for 40 terms. By standard military calculus, the human position was untenable within 48 hours of the initial drop. Their supply lines were severed here, at the pass we call the throat. Their ammunition reserves were calculated at less than 12 standard rounds per combatant. Yet, the command structure refused the transition to conditional surrender. Beside Paige, a student named Calvin was tapping furiously on a thin sheet of polished mica. The stylus made a dry, rhythmic, scritch sound that vibrated through the shared desk. Calvin was a decent sort. He had offered Paige half of his nutrient wafer during the first week of term, but he possessed the irritating habit of trying to categorize everything into neat, predictable columns. "You are missing the sub-bytes, Keller," Calvin whispered without looking up. His 3 eyes, stacked vertically down the center of his narrow face, blinked in sequence. "The professor is uploading the specific metabolic breakdown of the human rations during the 3rd week. It is relevant for the midterm evaluation." Paige didn't look at Calvin's slate. She didn't look at her own terminal either. Her desk was entirely bare save for a single stubby yellow pencil and a notebook with a frayed cardboard spine. The pencil was unsharpened. The notebook was empty. "I don't need the sub-bytes, Calvin," she said. Her voice was too quiet to carry across the room, but it had a flat, heavy quality that made Calvin's stylus pause for a fraction of a second. "The numbers are the grade," Calvin murmured, his secondary fingers twitching against the mica. "If you do not log the data, how will you understand the failure?" Down in the pit, Professor Arthur was pointing at a cluster of blue dots that had been pushed back against a sheer rock wall on the holographic map. "Observe the tactical error here," the professor said, his fingers slicing through the light. "The human remnant had an open corridor to the south. A tactical withdrawal would have preserved approximately 14% of their fighting strength. Instead, they dug into the shale. They utilized primitive kinetic ordnance and manual tools to create subterranean shelters that offered zero protection against orbital thermal sweeps." Paige reached down and touched her right knee. Through the thick, coarse fabric of her old wool sweater, an ugly green thing she'd brought from a farm outside New Austin, she could feel the jagged ridge of the surgical plate. When the humidity in the habitat ring dropped below 20%, the metal felt like an icicle pressed against the bone. She remembered the shale. It didn't look like amber light. It was gray, sharp as razor blades, and it got under your fingernails until the bed split and bled down the handles of the entrenching tools. It didn't feel like an error. It felt like wet socks, the smell of burnt grease from a broken generator, and the specific, high-pitched whistle of an incoming mortar that meant you had exactly 3 seconds to find out if your hole was deep enough. The human psychological profile under extreme duress, Arthur told the class, his limestone features remaining perfectly immobile, indicates a reliance on chemical surges, specifically adrenaline and cortisol, which override the logical centers of the brain. They do not fight to win at this stage. They fight because the mechanism for surrender has been jammed by their own biology. It is an expensive, messy pathology. The students around Paige nodded in unison, their styluses dancing across their slates like a flock of mechanical starlings. They were learning the geometry of her nightmares. They were writing down the cost of her brother's grave in kilojoules and tactical percentages. The lecture progressed with the slow, agonizing precision of an autopsy. Professor Arthur moved from the logistics to the specific timeline of the 3rd week at Iron Ridge. He brought up a chart showing the degradation of human fighting efficiency. By the 21st day, Arthur said, his throat clicks sharp, the Terran unit had lost all heavy artillery. Their water purification systems were fouled by sulfur runoff from the lower peaks. The standard biological requirement for a human includes approximately 2.5 liters of uncontaminated fluid per cycle. The logistics log shows they were operating on less than 400 milliliters of muddy water per individual. He paused, looking up at the tiers of students. Can anyone in the Advanced Tactical Division explain why the human commander, Captain Ross, did not utilize the open communication channel to request medical amnesty? A student 3 rows down, an aristocratic youth named Gideon, whose family owned 3 mining sectors in the Outer Rim, raised a long arm. The human ego structure prevents rational concession when observed by peer groups, Gideon said, his voice dripping with the effortless vocabulary of the elite. To accept amnesty would be to acknowledge the systemic inferiority of their logistical planning. An accurate assessment of their cultural literature, Arthur nodded, but incomplete. The primary factor is simpler. The human neurological architecture does not handle compounding probability well. They genuinely believed, despite a 98% variance against them, that an external variable would alter the outcome. Paige's thumb traced the edge of her unsharpened pencil. The wood was cheap cedar, its smell faint but distinct against the copper-tinged air of the hall. She remembered Captain Ross. He didn't have an ego structure. He had a wife named Martha who sent him letters written on paper that smelled like lavender, and he had a bad tooth that made him chew on the left side of his mouth until his cheek was raw. He hadn't stayed because of compounding probability. He'd stayed because Tommy Page's brother was lying in a trench 20 yards away with both legs pinned under a collapsed dugout, and every time Ross looked over the parapet, he could see the red dust from the enemy armor kicked up on the horizon. If they left the boys who couldn't walk. It wasn't math. It was just that nobody wanted to be the one to look Tommy's mother in the eye back in New Austin. Miss Keller. Arthur's voice broke through her thoughts like a stone through skin. Paige didn't jump. She slowly lifted her head, her chin resting on the collar of her frayed sweater. The professor had stopped the holoprojector. The Amber Mountain Range was frozen in mid-rotation, casting long, angular shadows across the tiered desks. Every head in the amphitheater had turned toward her. 37 pairs of eyes, some 2, some 3, fixed on the lone human sitting in the back corner. Your terminal has registered 0 data inputs since the commencement of this unit, Arthur said. His multi-jointed fingers were folded across his stomach, his limestone skin reflecting the dull light of the lecture pit. The Academy's exchange protocol is quite clear. Human observers are expected to maintain the same analytical standards as our primary applicants. Are you experiencing a technical failure with your interface? Calvin nudged her with his elbow, his face tight with a sort of secondary anxiety. Take my slate, he hissed under his breath. The professor will report this to the administrative liaison. They can rescind your habitat stipend. Paige ignored Calvin. She looked down at the professor, her eyes bloodshot from the dry air, her fingers still holding the small yellow pencil. The interface is fine, she said. Her voice wasn't loud, but without the competition of 40 typing styluses, it cut through the silence of the room like a blunt knife. Then why are you not taking notes? Arthur asked. His tone wasn't angry. It was worse. It was the patient, patronizing tone of an educator dealing with a child who couldn't understand the rules of a game. The details of the Iron Ridge engagement are complex. You will be required to reproduce the tactical vectors of the Terran retreat for your examination next week. Paige let go of the pencil. It rolled 2 inches to the left and stopped against the wire ring of her empty notebook. There wasn't a retreat, Paige said. The room grew very still. A soft, high-pitched whine from one of the overhead ventilation units became the loudest sound in the hall. Professor Arthur's nostrils flared in a slow, deliberate sequence. The official record from the Hegemony's historical archive clearly states that the Terran 3rd Infantry cleared the ridge on the 26th day at 0400 hours. The ground was abandoned. The ground wasn't abandoned, Paige said. She didn't stand up. She didn't take on a heroic posture. She stayed slouched in her cold polymer chair, her hands shoved deep into the pockets of her oversized sweater to hide the slight, involuntary tremor in her fingers. We didn't retreat. We ran out of people to hold the shovels. She looked directly into the professor's main eyes. You're asking why I'm not taking notes, Professor? It's because you're teaching my life, and you've got the map upside down. Arthur blinked, his secondary eyelids clicking shut and open. Miss Keller, this curriculum was compiled by the most advanced military minds of the core worlds. It is an objective analysis of... It's an obituary written by the people who watch through binoculars, Paige interrupted. She finally pulled her hands out of her pockets and pressed them flat against the desk. The plastic beneath her palms felt oily. You call it an expensive pathology. You say our chemical surges made us irrational, but your maps don't show the rain. They don't show how the gray mud turned into glue, or how the enemy's fancy tracked armor got stuck in the ravines because their automated navigation systems couldn't calculate how heavy the clay was when it was wet. She pointed a finger at the amber hologram floating in the pit. That blue dot you keep calling the logical failure point? That was a supply sergeant named Miller. He didn't have 12 rounds per man. He had 4. And he didn't stay because of a chemical surge. He stayed because he promised the boys in the medical tent that he'd keep the generator running long enough for the plasma to thaw. Gideon, the student from the mining sector, let out a dry, clicking chuckle. This is emotional sentimentality, Professor. It does not alter the strategic reality that the unit was eliminated. Paige didn't look at Gideon. She kept her eyes on Arthur. We weren't eliminated, kid. I'm sitting right here. And the only reason your family still owns those mining sectors is because the Hegemony spent so many resources trying to dig 37 of us out of that shale that their entire southern front collapsed 3 weeks later. She reached out and picked up her stubby yellow pencil, its lead tip dull and rounded. You want me to write down your percentages, Professor? I can tell you the exact weight of a standard Terran body bag when it's soaked through with mountain water. It's 84 kilograms. Write that down in your subbytes. Silence didn't fall. It settled like grit. Professor Arthur's nostrils flattened, his limestone jaw tightening into a hard, gray line that showed no teeth. He looked down at his light display, his fingers hovering over the kill switch of the hologram for 3 long seconds before he tapped it. The amber mountains vanished. The room returned to its uniform, fluorescent glare, leaving everyone's eyes blinking against the sudden whiteness. Class is dismissed, Arthur said. The throat clicks were muffled this time, lower in pitch. Miss Keller, remain behind. The students didn't linger. They moved with that strange, fluid grace peculiar to species that hadn't evolved on a world with heavy, wet gravity. Calvin shot her a look from his middle eye, a frantic, twitching signal that meant "I told you so" before he packed his mica sheet and slid out of the row. His three-toed boots made a soft thwip-thwip against the floor panels. Paige stayed where she was until the last jacket disappeared through the pneumatic double doors. Her knee was throbbing now, a dull, rhythmic ache that timed itself to the low hum of the ventilation fan. She stood up slowly, her joints popping in the quiet room. The green wool sweater felt heavy on her shoulders, smelling of old cedar and the harsh white vinegar she used to scrub her small quarters down in Sector 4. She walked down the steps, her boots loud and heavy compared to the soft scuffle of the previous occupants. Arthur didn't look up until she reached the edge of the projector pit. He was wiping down his terminal with a microfiber cloth, moving his hand in small, precise circles. "You are a difficult student, Paige," he said, using her first name without the formal prefix for the first time. "The Ministry of Integration suggested your presence here would foster cross-species synthesis. They did not mention you would use my lecture hall as a theater for historical revisionism." "It's not revisionism if you were there," Paige said, leaning her hip against the edge of the metal desk to take the weight off her bad leg. "Your archives are missing the context. You're looking at a house that burned down and trying to figure out why the chimney didn't run away." Arthur stopped wiping. He looked at her, his vertical nostrils expanding. A chimney is an inanimate structure. A soldier is an autonomous agent, capable of calculating risk. Your brother Thomas Keller, according to your file, had an exit vector. The telemetry from our reconnaissance drones showed the path was clear of seismic mines and heavy infantry for a 6-hour window. He chose to remain in a collapsed bunker with 3 non-viable casualties. The word non-viable tasted like cold grease in Paige's mouth. She reached into her pocket, her fingers finding a small, smooth pebble she'd picked up from the creek bed behind her house 2 years ago. She rolled it between her thumb and forefinger, using the hard friction to keep her voice from cracking. One of those non-viable casualties was a 19-year-old girl named Sarah who could play the harmonica upside down, Paige said. Her voice was flat, devoid of the theatrical anger Arthur probably expected. Another was a boy from the Ohio Valley who knew how to fix a water pump with a piece of wire and some chewing gum. Tommy didn't see telemetry, Professor. He saw Sarah. He saw Boyd. He knew that if he left them, the rats would get to them before the armor did. You can't calculate that because your people don't have names for things that aren't useful anymore. Arthur turned back to his console, his long fingers tapping a sequence into the glass. The purpose of this academy is to separate the name from the function. Miss Keller. If we allow the luxury of individual sentiment to govern strategic calculus, the system collapses. The system collapsed anyway, Paige said, turning toward the exit. You just haven't smelled the smoke yet. She walked back to her quarters through the long, curving corridors of the Riverdale Ring. The habitat didn't have weather, only cycles of light and dark that changed with a mechanical click behind the wall grates. Her room was 6 paces wide. It contained a cot with a coarse wool blanket, a small sink that dripped water every 11 seconds, and a single shelf holding 3 cans of salted beef she'd smuggled through customs in her laundry bag. She sat on the edge of the cot and pulled off her boots. Her right ankle was swollen, the skin stretched tight over the cheap titanium pins the field medics had hammered into her bone while the ridge was being shelled. She didn't cry. She hadn't cried since the day they put Tommy in the ground under a sky that was the color of a wet slate. She just sat there in the dim gray light of the habitat's sleep cycle, holding her unsharpened pencil until the cedar wood grew warm in her hand. 3 days later, the rain came. Not real rain. Riverdale was an enclosed ring, but the atmospheric regulators were cycling through their seasonal maintenance, which meant the air inside the academy was humid, heavy, and smelled distinctly of wet rust. The tactical lab was located in a massive subterranean vault, lined with black acoustic foam that absorbed sound so completely it made Paige's ears ring with her own heartbeat. Today was the midterm evaluation. The students were split into pairs, each assigned to a standard tactical cradle that simulated command decisions during historical brushfire wars. Page was assigned to Calvin, much to his visible distress. His violet skin looked mottled under the harsh worklights of the vault. "The parameters are fixed," Calvin muttered as they strapped into the leather cradles. His secondary hands were shaking slightly, his fingers twitching against the harness buckles. "We are commanding an auxiliary logistics node during the siege of the Red River. The enemy has broken through the primary line. The standard protocol for our species is immediate asset liquidation and self-termination to prevent data harvest. But since you are human, the simulator has adjusted the morale variables." "Don't liquidate anything," Page said, pulling the heavy, grease-stained leather straps over her shoulders. The simulator rigs were old, discarded hegemony stock, smelling of sweat and old copper wiring. "Just turn off the active sensors and stay small." "That is not a tactical option," Calvin said, his main eye wide with panic as the simulation initialized. The black foam walls vanished, replaced by the sharp artificial glare of a tactical display overlaying a muddy riverbed. "The interface requires a decision tree. Look at the numbers. The attrition rate is scaling at 12% per minute." The world around them dissolved into gray fog in the sharp artificial glare of tactical displays. In the simulation, they were crouched in a concrete blockhouse. Outside, the simulated sound of heavy artillery was a low structural vibration that shook Page's teeth in their sockets. It wasn't real, but her body didn't care. Her skin went cold, and the old scar on her knee began to prickle. Calvin's fingers flew across the virtual command console. He was trying to execute a textbook withdrawal, splitting his simulated forces into small, disposable units to distract the oncoming armor. "If we sacrifice the medical contingent," he yelled over the simulated thunder, "the command core has a 43% chance of reaching the extraction transport. It is the only logical path." "The medical contingent is holding the ammunition reserves, you idiot," Page barked, reaching across his arm and slamming her fist onto the manual override switch. The virtual screen flickered, turning a stubborn, bruised purple. "If you drop them, the armor doesn't stop to look at them. They just run them over and get to the transport faster." "Then what do we do?" Calvin cried out, three of his eyes blinking in a frantic, uncoordinated rhythm. "The enemy is within 300 meters. There is no victory condition left in the algorithm." "We don't look for one," Page said. She grabbed the manual steering yoke for the blockhouse's defensive turrets, an old twin-barrel kinetic system that the simulator had rendered with brutal, rusty accuracy. "We just make it too expensive for them to walk through the front door." She didn't use the automated targeting system. It was lagging under the simulated electronic jamming. Instead, she used the iron sights, her bad leg bracing against the frame of the seat, her teeth dug into her lower lip until she tasted copper. She fired. The simulator shook with the violent, rhythmic thud of the old guns. On the main display, their survival probability dropped to 0. The red bars swallowed the blue bars, but the red bars stopped moving forward. They bunched up in the narrow gap of the riverbed, blocked by the burning husks of their own lead vehicles, unable to advance because a single broken auxiliary node refused to clear the field. When the simulation finally timed out, the black foam walls of the vault returned. The air smelled of ozone and hot plastic from the overloaded cradle generators. Calvin sat back, his skin entirely violet now, his breath coming in short, wet gasps. "We died," he whispered. "The score is a failure. We achieved 0 tactical objectives." "Look at the clock, Calvin," Page said, her voice shaking as she unbuckled the leather straps. Her sweater was soaked with sweat at the armpits. "We held them for 24 minutes. The extraction transport didn't need 43% probability. It needed 20 minutes to get off the ground. They're gone. The boys in the sky made it home." Professor Arthur was standing at the exit of the lab vault, his long arms tucked into his gray robes. He had watched the feed from the master console. He didn't have his microfiber cloth this time. His limestone hands were perfectly still, The algorithm did not anticipate the usage of the medical contingent as a physical barricade, Arthur said as Paige walked past him, her boot dragging slightly on the concrete floor. It is an inefficient use of personnel. Paige stopped. She looked at the old scholar, seeing him clearly now not as an enemy, but as a creature born into a universe where everything had its place, where numbers never lied because the numbers never had to bleed in the dark. Efficiency is for people who know they're going to live until tomorrow, Professor, she said. She reached into her bag, pulled out her empty notebook and the unsharpened yellow pencil, and set them down on the small table by the door. Keep them. I won't be needing them for the final exam. I already know how the story ends. She walked out into the corridor, her heavy boots clicking against the floor panels, each step a slow, stubborn rhythm that the Academy's clean architecture would never quite know how to quiet. If this story reminded you that human defiance isn't found in clean equations, but in the muddy trenches where logic breaks down, then hit that like button. Share this video with someone who values grit over percentages, and subscribe to the channel for more raw, grounded tales of human endurance. Leave a comment below with your thoughts on Paige's stand. We read every single one. Stay stubborn out there, and we'll see you in the next chapter.